Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Hello. This is a more lively presentation. Feel free to talk and chat and participate. This is my talk, Big Ups, Universal Phonetic Stylings. If you've ever been misunderstood in conversation in a foreign language, or if you're just curious to know more about how the process of modifying a foreign accent works, this is the talk for you. I'm excited to share a lot about my experience and following the phrase, accents speak louder than words. My take on the kind of more famous cliche. Today we're going to, if I can step out here, we're going to invite you to do a few things. In particular, we're going to categorize sounds. That's kind of a big part of the process. We're building awareness. We're trying to understand a little bit more clearly what the process is like so you can measure it, so you can actually see the progress. And like many people here who have a system or at least would like one, we're going to give you a few steps, a few techniques to move closer to that. We're also ultimately going to try to connect with other native speakers. That's ultimately the goal. We're trying to speak and communicate, and that's a form of connection. It's a form of just human nature and wanting to be talking to somebody else with a natural accent. Ultimately, this will give you the confidence that you need to feel more into the conversation, to feel like you can continue studying, and it will ultimately give you the clarity that you need as you go through the process. We're going to give you lots of examples. I'll tell you a little bit more about my experience as an accent coach. I currently live in Los Angeles, and I work with students, with teachers, with performers, and all of them are trying to do the same thing. Get a little bit closer, understand a little bit more of what it's like to modify an accent and to sound like a native speaker in a few different languages. In some cases, it's about modifying your native language and switching from English, American English to British English, for example. In some cases, it's about just improving fluency. But in all cases, it's that connection, it's that clarity, it's that understanding of the system so you can actually move forward. I do this also to share, in general, a full-on structure. Today we're going to have like 3 different parts. Everything, you'll notice a trend of 3s. As mausim, what are we doing today? So that says, I should translate the slides. I was like, let me put some of the slides in a foreign language, and then realizing that not everybody will understand everything. As mausim, so what are we doing today? We're doing 3 things. We're initially setting up your mind. A lot of this is cognitive, learning, some theory, and I know it will be esoteric. The whole event is esoteric, but we're specifically going into an even more esoteric field, phonetics within linguistics. And there are certain things with the structure that you need to know before we move forward. The second thing is actually more phonetic, more setting up your mouth. The placement, all the nuances of sounds and consonants, vowels, all that stuff that you see here. And we'll talk about the variations that you see from language to language, and just try to give you a sense of confidence to be able to use one, to transfer this knowledge from one language to the next. And then lots of examples. Muchos ejemplos. That's on purpose, okay? There are 2 different languages in one slide. 3 languages, 4 languages, lots of languages. We got to get into it because there's too much information. I can't stall. Part 1, we'll get into it. Setting up your mind is important. The structure here is basically the following. There's lots of ways to break it all down. You could easily approach this, and think about this for a second, maybe. Just, if you could, yelling out your native languages. Native languages, what we got represented today? Espanol, Portuguese, Français, Polish, Deutsch, Ivrit. All right, a lot of European languages, a lot of got a Hebrew, we got some mixes here, Eastern European. It's important to know. And now, if you could, besides English, what is your number 1 target language? Everyone yelled Polish at the same time? Nihongo, Japanese? Nederlands? Dutch? Hindi? Love it. All right, so we got a nice mix here. Just to have a couple examples so we can use this in the talk. If you're going to structure your pronunciation practice, usually people will do one of a few different things. They'll like listen and repeat, shadowing all the things that you hear, buzzwords, passive learning, taking it in, watching shows, listening to music. It's all good. You should do that. But in today's talk, we'll learn about what to listen for, what to be able to shadow exactly, instead of just trying to repeat after the person. And there are many ways to break this down, but I've done it in a way that hopefully will make sense. I'm going to come back to this in a second here, but just to have a flow chart, because who doesn't love a good flow chart? Spoken language identity can be broken down into two areas. One side being the accent or the pronunciation, and the other side being the word choice or the dialect. If you happen to make a mistake, let's say, or cause confusion in a foreign conversation, it's usually because you said something with a weird sound or you chose a word that listener wasn't expecting to hear. And even further, if it's a dialect thing, if it's a word choice thing, you can go even deeper. You could say, I do have a little laser here. You could say that it's a grammatical issue. It's just you use the wrong preposition. Simple stuff. You use the wrong tense. You didn't pluralize it, all that stuff. You could just be missing the word. I don't know how to say frying pan or cherry or shallow, whatever the word is. I just don't know how to say that. I got to work around it. Accent, it comes in, even if the sounds are perfect. And then the biggest one is the idiomatic structures. Just the phrasing sounded weird. And that's part of the accent. It's, of course, more tied to sounds, usually more tied to sounds, but the dialect is a huge part of it. And we're mostly working on that. As language learners, we're all kind of zoomed into the right side. Good, because the left side is where we're going to spend the rest of our time today. Into sounds, and we call prosody. Prosody is another fancy term for that combination of rhythm and linking words together, as well as tone, intonation patterns. So as we move forward here, it's important to see that as language learners, and this is the thesis here, that's why it's in caps, you can and should learn all of the phonological patterns in your target language if your goal is to match the native accent, which I realize that's not everybody's goal. Not everybody wants to sound like a perfect native speaker. However, the phonology, if we can define some terms, is more about the relationship that all the available sounds that you have in the language have with the words and the sounds and how syllables just push together. If you don't understand certain concepts, it's hard to just listen and repeat because you're not looking for anything in particular. It's also something that we should know that phonetics, the other side, the other term we use, is more about actual production and where you put your teeth and your tongue and your lips. So if you're trying to figure out these phonological patterns, there are ways to go about doing it, but one thing that we'll talk about today is how you can use your languages that you already know, your native languages, to figure this out. So here's a question for you. ¿Cuántos idiomas tienes que hablar para reconocer patrones fonológicos? How many languages do you have to speak in order to recognize phonological patterns? Just your native ones. I say ones because a lot of people here have 2 or 3. And naturally, this phonology, this system of sounds is going to be easily found. It's like common public knowledge. You should be able to look that up either on Wikipedia or with some help from a Polyglot gathering talk. But the basis here, most of the time when we make mistakes in a foreign language with an accent, it's because we're bringing in aspects and sounds from our native language, right? I think that's fairly common knowledge. But if you don't know how your language works, if you don't know that you have variations of certain sounds, not all the T's and D's and R's are pronounced the same as the target language, it becomes hard to understand what are you doing wrong. People will say, I detect an accent. Where is that accent from? It sounds exotic, or whatever they say. And if you can't pinpoint what that is, you might first start to look at your native language. What's actually happening in your system, in your phonology. Now, structurally, we have the sounds, we have the prosody, and there's another possible structure change that will happen, which is some kind of variation that is explainable by these three potential areas, topics. The first is my favorite thing to talk about, prescriptive and descriptive pronunciation. Is everyone familiar with this? Yes and no, some people. Well, we got to talk about it. Prescriptive language or grammar or pronunciation is just dealing with how something is supposed to be pronounced or used. It's the rules, it's the book, it's the actual isolation. If you see a word, for example, the letter A in English is pronounced like that. If someone sees a letter A on a page and asks, how do you pronounce that word? It's just pronounced A. But if you put it into a phrase, a book, a car, the pronunciation changes. Is the descriptive pronunciation, and A is prescriptive. So if you constantly use prescriptive language, it sounds a little bit overpronounced, perhaps. It could sound a little bit formal. We're not dealing with formality here necessarily. This is not about rudeness or politeness. It's not about professionalism or just common. It's more just about conversational changes that happen. And if you're aware of them, even better. Some languages don't have such a big gap between prescriptive and descriptive language, but English sure does. All the examples from today, you'll see at least 10 or 12 languages where we'll see some changes with those two terms. Regional use, a second one too, is huge, especially for languages that have multiple varieties. English, German, Spanish, Chinese. I mean, I imagine even there's main differences between Slovak, east to west. There's just kind of everything has some regional tie, whether it's political, whether it's just a personal choice. And those are things that are important to tie in. Obviously, there's two kind of main systems we're dealing with here. One of them is within the native language, what are the boundaries that you have considering all the regions? Like, what are the sounds that you can still pronounce and still sound native? For example, I'll have students that come up to me and say, Ruben, do I have an American accent or a British accent? And neither? Can I secret option C? I usually have to remind people that it's not just about choosing the region and saying, okay, I want a British accent or an American accent. It's like you have to remove the Argentina before you go into the foreign system. It's a hard thing to do, and if you're not even aware of what those sounds are and what that sounds like, the regional use is for later. That's for another time. Focus on the first steps. And the last part here, the probability, and you'll see some more examples of this. The probability of use is more like if there are multiple ways to say the same word or phrase, both descriptive or prescriptive, like interesting. You can say interesting or interesting. One word, three different ways you can say it. Which one do you choose? You get to choose. You get to choose. Which one? That's a open-ended question for you to figure out. But that whole thing is based on the fact that these are all native-sounding pronunciations. They're not probability based on the foreign accent. It's probability within that native system. Esempi, alcuni esempi. So the prescriptive-descriptive side here, you have the T's in this phrase. I guess it makes sense to put it all together. Don't get caught. Don't get caught. those T's are typically unaspirated at the end of a word or of a syllable. They're not just unaspirated, they're kind of muted. They're not silent, but if you pronounce them, it sounds like you don't understand how we talk. It's not about necessarily just linking words together, because you would just say the word don't without the T. It's not about linking, although that's part of it too. Don't get caught. You could even switch the T's out for K's in this specific example. Don't get caught. Portuguese example here on the second row is focusing on the O letter. Do lado errado, errado, Adonai errado. So when you say do lado errado, you see the O's will change from an O sound, do lado errado, to more of an U pronunciation. Why does this happen? Doesn't matter exactly, but you should know. It's the final syllable being unstressed, and the O's become U. It's something you usually hear early on, but if you're not listening for it, it becomes harder to catch. Bechol, Hebrew examples here, you could say bekol or bechol, depending on your prescriptive, descriptive choice. Bechol ofen, bekol ofen. Sometimes in idioms or phrases, it sounds better to be proper. Bechol. You have, bechol means in every or in all. The second example is le'eroz or la'aroz, the word for to pack in Hebrew. And if you look at the nikud, the dots and lines that determine how Hebrew words are supposed to be pronounced, which is technically really prescriptive, you're supposed to say le'eroz, le'eroz, le'ehov, le'echol. But everybody says la'aroz, la'aroz tamizvada. Pitron or pitaron. Pitron for solution, or yitron, same word, yitaron. These are things that are barely noticeable for learners at a beginner or intermediate stage. But if you pick up on these things early on, you start to feel more connected, more confident, understanding that not every letter is pronounced the same way from word to word. For regional use, you have the classic, clásico, yo me llamo. If you studied Spanish or you know anything about Latin American varieties of Spanish, that yo or yo from Argentina stands out, Uruguay. Sorry about tomorrow. Any idea what this is about? These are Canadian English words that stand out whenever Americans hear them. In particular, not everybody talks this way, but some people pronounce it instead of sorry, as we do in the US, they would say something like sorry. Sorry, sorry. And they're so polite, so they say it a lot. About is a standard kind of classic Canadian raising. We call this Canadian raising because the vowel height gets higher. About instead of about. And tomorrow you might hear from a Canadian. But that's about it. There's like 5 or 6 words that really stand out between Americans and Canadians. And if you hear those, you might be able to tell someone's regional accent. The R's in this last example in Portuguese, so if you pronounce R's at the end of a syllable here, you'll see porta. There's 3 ways to say this in Portuguese. You can say the porta like an American R, verde sorte, gives off a specific vibe and a personality. You can say porta verde sorte, or sorte. You can kind of have that São Paulo Spanish flavor. Or you can do the whole Carioca, porta, verde, sorte, which pretty much changes the whole word, no? I think that whole thing is very telling. If a non-native speaker could do any of that consistently, always doing the R's consistently, you start to stand out in the good way. Probability of use here, contractions and fillers are only on here mostly because of the sounds that are created. I realize they're actually words, contractions, but filler sounds and some contractions can just kind of turn out like sounds. And saying I'm like I'm trying to just the idea that people speak a little bit more descriptively, and that is part of this overlap here, I guess. The probability might be high that someone speaks descriptively. Whether you say livriut or labriut, in Hebrew for bless you after somebody sneezes is up to you. I don't know. Labriut, Hebrew speakers, or livriut? Labriut? Livriut? Both. All right, so the probability is sometimes 50-50. But it's a good sign if you know that it's both. It's way more of a confident feeling than if it's 90 and 10%, right? If we have one strong lean, it's harder to be in the minority. But if it's 50-50, why not? For proper names, this is probably the hardest thing to change, cognates and words that are spelled the same from language to language. This is another probability. If you're speaking Spanish and you're talking about Starbucks, you have to say it in Spanish. Starbucks, 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 whatever. Boston. We have like English speakers who learn Spanish. Y dicen vivo en Boston. And they change their accent. But like you got to say Boston or whatever the phrase is, you know? How do you pronounce this store that sells furniture that you build? IKEA. How do Americans say it? Or something that gives everybody the most trouble. The third group is where we're going to spend all of our time. The unexpected sounds here are the ones that are slightly off. They're not exactly the same. They're probably spelled the same in both languages. Watch out for transliterations. If you speak a language that has a different alphabet, we still ultimately have to transliterate that into whatever the alphabet is that you use. Be careful to realize that there might be hidden nuances, or we call it allophones. Allophones we'll talk a little bit about in this next section. We got to set up the mouth. We got the structure here. We got the sounds. We got prosody. We have understanding variation happens with prescriptive, descriptive, all these different changes, 3 different types of sounds that we're sticking with, the ones that are just slightly off. When it comes to setting up your mouth, we have the 3 pieces. I'm kind of breaking this now into vowels, into consonants, into prosody, the other things, the rhythm, linking, and intonation. If you have different vowel sounds in a target language, you should consider a few things. One is the origin, or where the sound starts. This is where it gets kind of specific, esoteric. And thinking about that famous, vowel chart, that whole quadrilateral that you see on Wikipedia and online pages to describe where sounds happen from. It's not the easiest thing for most people to grasp of what's a back high vowel. Maybe some of you are like, oh, that's easy, ooh, or something. But it's not so easy. And sometimes vowels move. And you have to know where they move from and where they move to. Those are small things that you can't always see in someone's mouth. You can't say, hey, slowly say that, as I stare at your teeth and see where your tongue goes. It's not only weird, but people just don't want to do that for you. The tongue placement is part of vowels too, is what's happening with your tongue. That you sometimes can see. And that's an easy thing to say, hey, stick out your tongue or show me that slower. We're talking about nasal sounds in this too, because when you make a nasal sound, a nasal vowel sound, you're doing some kind of closure, some kind of seal where that air is being sent up to your nose. So how do you make that sound? And it's nice to sometimes see a physical diagram, but even that is really difficult to make sense of. Like, so my tongue goes there. I can't see my tongue. You tell me, am I doing it right? So feedback is a part of this too, but in general, we want you to know what you're listening for. The lip movement of a sound is so important, and we'll show you in these examples here how this works, but whether your lips are round or small, or just looking at your lips in the mirror and seeing, or in a camera, and seeing how far apart they are, it's unreal. Let's take these examples here with the origin. Le mashal, for example, the word Sue, the name Sue in English. Think about this just for a second. What's the difference between the English name, the Spanish, Italian, all the languages that have su as a word, and then the Japanese syllable su. What's happening with the sound? Well, you could think about the origin being u, su, for a lot of the Latin languages, su, u. The lips are stop moving for a second, sing this, su, u. Your lips are so small and so rounded, u. When I say it in English, Sue, hi, I'm Sue. My lips are nowhere near that closure, and even in Japanese, I'm like desu. My lips are relaxed. I'm not rounding anything, and this also might have to do with lips and origin together. Lots of this is happening at the same time. But if you can go from one accent to the next, if you can actually imitate one going to the next, you're in really good shape. I encourage everybody to imitate the accent, to try to do these the wrong way, so to speak. Think of the word feel or cool. These words are words that if you listen to a little kid say them in English, they stretch them out. It kind of sounds like two completely different vowels. Feel, where that L, that dark L or that O kind of goes in the back. Cool. The origin of the sound moves. If you say cool and feel, cool, feel, cooler, if you add an extra sound here, we'll talk about this, it comes off differently. The L in that case, in your language, you probably have it as a consonant. An actual L. Here in English, we use it as more of a vocalic consonant here, feel, cool, like you sometimes hear in Slavic languages, the ol sound. Full and fur are tongue movements. If you have trouble with these two words in English, it's only a tongue thing. You don't really need your lips to say full or fur. Whether your tongue is curled back, whether your tongue is flat, whether it's obstructing some air. Fur and full. I understand that's obviously a slight thing that's also very difficult to see and even feel. How many of you guys can pronounce the largest city in Brazil? Not the capital. São Paulo. São. How do you pronounce the next word in Portuguese? Sal. Yeah, sal. Big ow. You might be confused as to why there's an A if it's not a, right? São. It's the tongue doing stuff. It's a nasalized vowel, but that means something. What does that mean exactly? It's important to identify that. If you're learning Portuguese and you come up to the a chiu, the a chiu, then it's important to see that difference. I'm going to move a little bit here. The consonant sounds deal with three things: voicing, whether you feel vibration or not. Placement, is it a bilabial, dental sound, velar, all these different terms, and what type of sound is it? A stop, fricative, all these terms that we describe how the air moves. The prosody also is three different categories. We're talking about rhythm. Where do you put the stress? In any word, in any phrase, linking words together. Which words in a sentence need to be parsed and grouped together? And then the intonation, which is tied to rhythm too. When you make a syllable stressed, you tend to raise the pitch. And so that will come in handy in a lot of these examples. I got to move a little bit quickly because we don't have time to get through all the examples, unfortunately. But in vowel sounds, the first Japanese, these are like names of people. So it'd be hard for an American to say these words because we treat them like diphthongs. We treat them like one actual vowel sound, something like sai or kai. Whereas in other languages, if you speak most languages and you're learning Japanese, this would be an easy hiatus, an easy double vowel sound. Sae, kai, aemet, kaele. This moving vowels together is not easy, particularly for English speakers. Saying eu, euro, or deu, deun is a weird thing for a lot of people. Just figuring out what is weird for you. Noticing that sounds change from, in Spanish here we have letters that go from different manners of articulation, from stops to fricatives. the B changing to kind of like a V. It goes from a bilabial stop to a bilabial fricative. Íbamos, puedo, even a G in the word jugo. Quickly, voiceless to voice sounds. The B in the word for 21st or 22nd, you can see, I can show you this specific letter, this P sound, this ip becomes a B from a P to a B to say I shibir instead of I ship, where you can see in the third, you say I shipsam, I shibir, this P becomes a B just because it's between vowel sounds in the number. Specific examples. The vowel changes in the word knife to knives for some Americans. These are just things that are going to happen within the language, and if you don't know about, it's totally cool, but it's important to pick out either from a coach or from somebody that can show you these things so that you can sound even closer to that of a native speaker. All right, I got to move a little bit because we have some questions probably too, but we'll do this as the last one. Assimilation is the last kind of term I want to leave you with, so you know that it's possible for a sound to change based on what's coming before it or after it. So in English, when you say have to, that V changes to an F because of the voiceless T coming up. That's regressive assimilation. Have to, has to, even though those are V's and S's that are pronounced like Z's. Parked and runs, also affected by the previous letter. Progressive. As duas, as, you pronounce that S like a Z because the D is voiced. As duas and as tres, because you pronounce that as a voiceless sound because the T coming up. All right, I'm going to share these slides with everybody too. I will have to kind of go through these and move quickly. There is way too much that I try to include in 30 minutes, but I want to talk about this more and more. But I do want to get to questions as well. The main idea here is to just focus on the pronunciation early on in the language acquisition process. It's something that people usually wait until the end to start. And if you have no idea what that's like, it can be a huge problem as you're changing habits that you've been creating for years and years and kind of waiting to focus on the pronunciation until later. Thank you so much. Dziękuję. I hope that you guys can learn from this. We'll talk soon. Apologies, there was just so much to talk about. Feel free to yell out questions if they're not on here. Do I also know how to do the European Portuguese accent? I mean, as much as a Brazilian knows. You know, like instead of saying G, there's this D sound. You know I couldn't imitate it the same way. The Brazilian accent in English is very dramatic. It's very, for me, can be a problem. Have to do, to go, Mas opa. For me, it's crazy how you should have started with these imitations, in fact. The European accent doesn't have that same response. Do you use the IPA as part of your teaching? Yeah, man. There are a lot of people who don't like it. And I get it. It's a whole different system. It's like learning how to read music just so you can play the piano. But like, I just want to play, man. So it's a great tool to use. I don't knock the IPA. I just think there are a lot of better ways to acquire an accent than just using symbols. It's hard enough to balance the IPA symbols from English, American English, British English. Inevitably, you're going to have some symbol that you don't know how to pronounce exactly, and what's the point? It's sometimes, I would say, the best example of cross accent modification is to use something in that native language that it can be spelled to give a pronunciation in the target language. I'll give you an example. How do you say the number 3 in Spanish? Uno, dos? Tres. How does an American say it? You guys know? Uno, dos. Tres, yeah, trace. Usually trace like you would trace your hand. So for anybody who's trying to learn Spanish from English, we just give them the word today. Today, tomorrow. And have them say today, today. Kind of say it fast. Today, today. Put a little S at the end of it. And today's. Today. If they're saying trace, and you get them to say today's. Today's. It's like a little, and no IPA was necessary in the making of that sound. It's just kind of a relationship. So I use more of the target of the native language of students than I use IPA as a realistic, I'm going to change the accent strategy. Who drew the visuals on your slides? Who drew the visuals? Is that a compliment? I'll take that as a compliment. That could go either way. Who the heck? A lot of different things. There were some photos. There were some templates going on there. We'll talk. I'll get you some slide templates after. How can I improve my pronunciation for the languages I already know on a high level, but still didn't master the native accent? I'll tell you how to do it. 3 ways. One is an education in this stuff that I've just shared with you. You have to know what sounds exist in your language, in the target language. You have to have an education a little bit in phonetics and phonology. It's just the basic bare minimum. You also have to have consistent feedback. You have to know where the accent stands out. Someone that's honest with you and just says, "Oh, yeah, you just did a Portuguese T there. That was a chi. That wasn't a T." You have to have that consistently, or at least in patterns, so that you can identify what for you is going to stand out. You can do the helpful thing, which is know that you have a native language and that the target language and your native language are naturally different. But if you don't know what that difference is, start there. And the last thing of the 3 is to have a strategy. And I don't mean some intense morning routine, or I don't think any of this involves having a long-term strategy. This accent modification should be mastered in months, let's say, not years, weeks even, but I'm talking about the knowledge and what you need to know, and not always in the practical change your actual accent. But even at a high level, especially at a high level, because you've kind of acquired all these habits, it's really important to figure out what you're doing with all these habits. What have you acquired in the good way and in the bad way? I don't want to say that everything is bad. You know, there's some things that you need to know feedback-wise that are really good. You have to have people say, "Wow, that's incredible. How did you do that? That sounds just like my brother-in-law," or whatever. So, education, feedback, strategy for the win. What do you think of trying to speak your mother tongue with a foreign accent to help you acquire and understand the accent in target language? That's the best way to do it. I've been telling you guys for years. That's the kind of thing, I know, right? The energy comes at the end of the talk. You have to do that. That's what I started doing for years. Before I spoke a word of Hebrew or like a phrase of Hebrew, I would imitate my family. My dad's from Israel, all the families in Israel, and they would say, Ruben, enjoy from the weekend. Ruben, it was like I would just repeat what they said after they said it, and I would try to speak Hebrew English, Israeli English, all day long. And people would say, "Wow, you sound Israeli." And I'm like, "I don't even speak Hebrew." And it was like this fun running joke, but once I figured out, I realized I should just learn Hebrew. Stupid, I can imitate it, but I can't speak it. What's wrong with me? So I think you should definitely do that. I think that's the most fun way to do it. I think that everybody has access to foreigners in their language, and you can imitate how they use your language. If you can do that, you can extract the sound system from the language itself. Amazing. Do that. Why don't people have an accent when they're singing? Some people do. But I think what you mean is like, when people sing and you hold out notes, hold out vowel sounds, it's harder to hear an accent. You can't tell if someone's American or British, for example, when they sing. The vowels all sound British. You don't really have R sounds to kind of carry it over. But I work with singers who have strong accents, and you can definitely hear it when they sing. And so it's actually kind of a difficult thing to master, to sing in a foreign language. Some of us are doing it already at the talent show and everything, but people have accents, and that comes through very, very obviously if you're not a native speaker. Do you ever get people who get upset at the idea of changing people's accents? How do you respond to this? Oh yeah, all the time. Don't change my accent. That's my identity. Don't change me. It's who I am. It's like you can be lots of things, man. You can be a different person. You can be a different persona. And I think this is the most sincere answer, I think, is that this isn't for every single person. You don't have to change the way that you speak. But the accent is the form of a spoken language. Just like a golfer has a stroke, a form. Tennis and piano players and musicians all have a technique. There's a way to do it that the best people who do that activity, that physical activity, that's how they do it, that's how they train. There's a form to speaking a language. It's not the best people, they're not professional language speakers, but there are native speakers. And if you can match that form, whether it's through imitation or through actual training and trying to figure out what these nuances are, it's totally a learnable skill. So if you don't want to do it, you definitely don't have to. No one's changing who you are or your cultural identity. It's sometimes a fun thing, and this is probably the best reason why you would change it. People who say that have never had people say to them, oh, you're from Germany. Oh, you must be from Switzerland, or whatever your country you're not from. Or, oh, you speak English, and they switch to your language. And you're like, I came to Poland to practice Polish. But I obviously failed, so I get my English in return. Any type of accent that gives away an identity, it takes the whole conversation over to that accent. You start to say, oh gosh, where are you from? Oh, Mexico? My family has a timeshare in Mexico. We go there every summer. And you're like, I just wanted to get the burger, and I wanted to get out of here. But now we're talking about your timeshare in Mexico, but that's okay. It's just frustrating. It's funny a couple times, but it's frustrating eventually. And if you don't know what that's like, it's hard to judge. So do it if you like. It's a fun thing to change. You can always go back to your non-native accent. I promise you won't forget how to do it. Keep going. How do you find out about the less noticeable differences between your native language and your target languages? Look up allophones in target language. Google allophones in Spanish, allophones in Japanese. That's one term. We didn't get to as much, but allophones are variations of sound from one letter pronounced many different ways. The talk I gave 2 years ago was the 7 different pronunciations of T in English. And so, watch the Ruben Polyglot Gathering talks. There's some tips for you, but it's not an easy thing. Look for the things we talked about in this talk: vowel sounds, zoom in on the sounds, zoom in on prosody, get a coach, get feedback, get an education, build a strategy, all those things. Dutch accent, oh gosh, this is the Ruben show. I can't do a Dutch accent, unfortunately. I'll skip past. And Greek accent, well, this was just like now do accents. Do it for us, dance. What's the funniest accent for you? I think they all have funny things about them if you make them fun, It's kind of, the fun thing is like saying random stuff with an accent that you wouldn't expect to hear that. I suppose Brazilian and Israeli are my go-to, or Spanish are my go-to accents. But the Indian accent, what do you want to do? Okay, where are you going? Who are you going with? And okay, this like retroflex D, T, B, D. It's always fun, but it's sometimes a harder one to do. Asian accents are hard to do in English because people feel like it's wrong or is judgy or racist. But I think same idea with all these accents. If you try to overdo it or make fun of it, then yeah, it will come into that realm. But if you're just objectively moving towards those sounds, if you know linguistically where that's coming from, it's a little bit safer and hopefully more accurate. Other questions about Ruben doing accents. Can you show us how your Polish sounds? If I know a phrase or two, you know. What have I learned in, one of the examples was przepraszam, but I'm not sure if a phrase even comes out in Polish. Give me a phrase. Polish speakers? No, it's hard to do. It's hard to do. Was that a tongue twister?
That's normal sense.
They all sound like tongue twisters to me. Oh, that was actually good. I was very creative on your toes. But I can't do that right now from off the cuff, unfortunately. How about this? I'll put together a reel of all the accents I can do, imitate-wise, and I'll share them with everybody here. I definitely focus on the languages that I speak, but different English accents, different Spanish accents usually come out. But Polish is too new for me, unfortunately. Other questions here besides the requests to do accents?
So maybe the last question, because we've already 3 minutes.
Sorry about the overtime. Well, thank you to everybody for coming today, for learning a little bit more about accents. I'll see you soon.